Some people think power comes from a title printed on a little plastic badge. They're wrong. Real power is knowing exactly when to stay silent while someone else destroys their own future. At exactly 6:47 on a cool Tuesday morning, the sharp metallic snap of bolt cutters sliced through the quiet of Willow Creek Estates, echoing between rows of spotless houses where every mailbox matched and every lawn looked like it had been trimmed with a ruler. I was standing just inside my kitchen, a mug of black coffee warming my hands, watching through the narrow gap in the blinds as Bethany Collins leaned over the security chain wrapped around my Jeep. The smell of fresh-cut grass drifted through the cracked window, mixing with the faint scent of motor oil that always seemed to follow that old Wrangler no matter how many times I washed it. Bethany glanced over both shoulders, adjusted her expensive sunglasses, then squeezed the handles of the bolt cutters with surprising confidence. Clang! The chain dropped onto the concrete. She smiled. Not the smile of someone solving a problem. The smile of someone convinced the rules only existed for everyone else. She waved toward a waiting tow truck idling across the street, its diesel engine rumbling softly in the morning air. The driver rolled forward without hesitation as if they had rehearsed the scene before sunrise. From a distance it probably looked official. HOA President supervising the removal of an abandoned vehicle. Another neighborhood improvement. Another victory for community standards. That's exactly what she wanted every camera on the street to believe. What she didn't know was that every camera she was counting on to support her story actually belonged to me. I didn't rush outside. I didn't yell. I didn't call the local police. I simply watched the tow operator hook up the Jeep while Bethany folded her arms with the satisfaction of someone checking the final item off a to-do list. She even pointed toward my garage, saying something I couldn't hear through the glass before laughing with the driver. The entire performance lasted less than 4 minutes. 4 minutes to create a mistake that would keep attorneys, investigators, and auditors busy for months. Most of my neighbors stayed hidden behind curtains, pretending not to notice. Around here, people learned long ago that arguing with Bethany only guaranteed your own violation notice by the end of the week. She ruled our subdivision with meeting agendas, certified letters, and carefully rehearsed speeches about preserving property values. Everyone feared becoming her next example. Everyone except me. As the Jeep slowly disappeared around the corner, the silence that followed felt strangely heavier than the sound of the chain hitting the driveway. I took one final sip of coffee, placed the mug beside the window, unlocked my phone, and dialed a number that wasn't listed anywhere in the neighborhood directory. The man who answered didn't waste time with greetings. I quietly gave him the vehicle identification number, confirmed the timestamp, and said 6 simple words that changed everything. They've just moved the task force Jeep. There was a pause, so brief most people wouldn't have noticed it. Then his voice became calm enough to make the back of my neck tighten. Understood, Agent Walker. Nobody touches another thing. People always assume federal investigations begin with flashing lights, dramatic raids, or someone pounding on a front door before sunrise. Most of the time they begin with paperwork, patience, and ordinary people making extraordinary mistakes. I had learned that lesson from my father long before I ever earned my credentials. He spent 28 years wearing a city police uniform and never once came home bragging about arrests. Instead, he talked about evidence, discipline, and never letting emotions outrun facts. My grandfather had served in the Marine Corps, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who believed respect was earned one decision at a time. Between the two of them, I grew up understanding that the strongest move was usually the one nobody noticed until it was too late. After college, I joined law enforcement, worked narcotics for several years, and eventually earned a position with a regional drug task force that partnered with local agencies, federal, investigators, and specialized intelligence units. Because of the work, privacy was never optional. My neighbors did not know what I actually did for a living, and I intended to keep it that way. As far as anyone in Willow Creek Estates knew, I was another Army Reserve veteran who traveled often and preferred old vehicles over shiny luxury cars. That assumption suited me just fine. The Jeep sitting in my driveway looked almost forgettable. The faded paint carried years of dust from back roads across 3 states. Small scratches covered the doors. The tires looked ordinary. Anyone walking past would probably think it belonged to a guy who enjoyed weekend camping trips and did his own repairs in the garage. Nobody noticed the reinforced mounting brackets hidden beneath the frame, the custom electrical routing tucked behind factory panels, or the discrete identification numbers placed exactly where trained personnel expected to find them. The vehicle had a purpose, and that purpose had nothing to do with impressing homeowners obsessed with curb appeal. Every unusual detail served a legal function authorized through official channels, and every modification had been documented down to the smallest connector. That was why I never argued whenever Bethany complained about it. She sent certified letters claiming it lowered property values. She attached photographs with bright red circles around the bumper and antenna. She quoted sections of the neighborhood covenants that did not actually apply to government-authorized equipment. I simply filed every notice into a folder inside my office, scanned each page, and added the date to a timeline that had been quietly growing for months. My younger sister, Emily, thought I was being too patient. She taught 4th grade at the elementary school across town and believed every problem could be solved by sitting people down for an honest conversation. She even volunteered to meet Bethany one afternoon, carrying copies of my deployment records and official parking authorization. Emily returned home less than 20 minutes later with disappointment written all over her face. She placed the folded papers on my kitchen counter and told me Bethany had barely glanced at them before insisting that neighborhood standards outweighed personal circumstances. Emily apologized for not accomplishing anything, but I smiled because she had unknowingly given me something far more valuable than an agreement. She had confirmed exactly how confident Bethany had become, and people who believe they are untouchable almost always stop paying attention to the line between authority and overreach. Over the next several weeks, I began seeing Willow Creek Estates through Bethany Collins's eyes, and that explained more than any conversation ever could. She did not see neighbors. She saw compliance reports. She did not see homes. She saw opportunities to remind people who signed the violation letters. Every morning at almost the same time, she drove slowly through the subdivision in her spotless white sport utility vehicle with a clipboard resting on the passenger seat and a phone mounted on the dashboard. She would stop without warning, take photographs of a trash can left out an extra hour, measure the height of holiday decorations long after everyone else had stopped caring, and leave bright orange notices tucked neatly under windshield wipers. Some homeowners quietly paid the fines because they did not want trouble. Others attended board meetings hoping to appeal, only to discover the outcome had already been decided before the meeting even began. Bethany always spoke with perfect confidence, quoting rules from memory while reminding everyone that preserving standards protected property values. The board rarely challenged her because she had served as president for nearly 6 years, and several members simply followed her lead without asking uncomfortable questions. I noticed another pattern that interested me far more than the violation letters. The same towing company appeared again and again whenever someone fell behind on fines or questioned the association's authority. The trucks arrived unusually fast, sometimes within 30 minutes of a complaint being filed. That level of coordination suggested a relationship built over time, not random scheduling. I made a note of every company logo, every truck number, every driver I recognized. None of that information meant anything by itself, but investigations are built from ordinary details that eventually fit together. Bethany, meanwhile, became increasingly interested in my driveway. Every few days, another certified envelope appeared in my mailbox claiming the vehicle violated one regulation or another. One letter insisted it had remained parked too long. Another argued that its appearance damaged the neighborhood image. A third demanded immediate removal because of equipment that she described as unauthorized external modifications. Ironically, each complaint proved she had been inspecting the Jeep more closely than anyone else in the subdivision. She even began walking past my property during evening strolls, slowing just enough to study the vehicle before continuing down the sidewalk with her small notebook in hand. One Saturday morning, I was changing the air filter in my garage when my next-door neighbor, Frank Donovan, wandered over carrying a paper cup of coffee. Frank had lived there almost 15 years and had seen 3 different homeowners association presidents come and go. He lowered his voice before speaking, almost out of habit. He told me Bethany had recently pressured several neighbors into supporting stricter parking enforcement even though there had never been serious complaints before. According to Frank, she kept saying that one resident believed the rules did not apply to him and that she intended to prove otherwise. He never mentioned my name, but neither of us needed him to. Before walking back across the lawn, Frank paused and quietly said something that stayed with me. He said the problem with people who confuse authority with ownership is that eventually they start believing everything they can see belongs to them. I watched him head home, then looked back at the empty space beside my Jeep where the broken chain had rested earlier that week. Bethany believed she was preparing to win a neighborhood dispute. She had no idea she was slowly building a timeline that reached far beyond homeowners association meetings, neighborhood bylaws, or the limits of her carefully protected influence. By the end of that week, the neighborhood had settled into an uneasy routine, but underneath the quiet streets, something had clearly shifted. Bethany was no longer satisfied with mailing violation notices or making comments during board meetings. She wanted a public victory, something visible enough that every homeowner would remember what happened when someone challenged her authority. I could almost predict her schedule. Every Monday, another certified envelope arrived. Every Wednesday, another inspection photograph appeared in the online homeowner portal. Every Friday, a new deadline demanded immediate compliance, even though each notice contradicted the one before it. I never responded with anger. I simply scanned every document into a secure archive, recorded the delivery times, and compared each claim against the association bylaws. The inconsistencies kept growing. One afternoon, Emily stopped by after school carrying groceries for dinner. She looked exhausted before she even stepped through the front door. She told me Bethany had approached her in the parking lot outside the elementary school and casually mentioned that people who defended rule breakers often damaged their own reputations. It was not an outright threat, but it was close enough to make Emily uncomfortable. She asked if she should report the conversation. I told her to write down exactly what had been said while it was still fresh in her memory, then leave the rest to me. Facts have a way of becoming much more valuable than emotions when enough of them begin pointing in the same direction. 2 days later, another letter appeared, this time announcing that the association had determined my vehicle presented an ongoing violation requiring immediate corrective action. The wording caught my attention because it referred to authority the board did not actually possess. Someone had either misunderstood the governing documents or assumed nobody would ever read them carefully. Later that afternoon, I attended the monthly Homeowners Association meeting for the first time since moving into the neighborhood. Bethany smiled politely as residents took their seats, then moved through the agenda with practiced confidence. When my address appeared on the projector screen, she spoke for nearly 5 minutes about preserving community standards without mentioning my name directly. Several board members nodded along while homeowners avoided eye contact. I waited until public comments opened before standing. In a calm voice, I asked her to identify the specific covenant granting authority to remove a legally registered vehicle from private residential property without a court order or the owner's consent. The room became noticeably quieter. Bethany shuffled through several pages, quoted a paragraph about parking regulations, then quickly moved to the next agenda item without answering the question. Most people probably overlooked the moment, but I noticed one board member exchange a concerned glance with another. Doubt had entered the room for the first time. As the meeting ended, I walked outside beneath the warm Texas evening sky while the scent of fresh asphalt drifted across the parking lot from a nearby road project. Behind me, I could hear Bethany speaking quietly with a man wearing a towing company polo shirt who had not attended any previous meetings. They stopped talking the instant they noticed me walking toward my truck. Neither one smiled. Neither one offered an explanation for why a towing contractor needed to sit through a homeowners association meeting. I drove home without looking back, but I remembered his face, the company logo stitched onto his shirt, and the license plate on his pickup. Sometimes the smallest details become the first pieces of a much larger picture, and deep down I had the unmistakable feeling that Bethany had already decided the next move she was going to make. The following Monday arrived with the same peaceful appearance every suburban neighborhood tries so hard to protect. Sprinklers clicked across perfectly trimmed lawns before sunrise, joggers waved politely as they passed one another, and delivery trucks moved from house to house without attracting a second glance. On the surface, everything looked ordinary. Underneath, several independent timelines had quietly begun moving toward the same destination. By 8 o'clock that morning, I had already uploaded every homeowners association letter, every security recording, every certified envelope, and every photograph into an encrypted evidence archive maintained through official channels. I was careful not to exaggerate anything because facts never need embellishment. Dates, timestamps, signatures, surveillance footage, and public records were more persuasive than opinions could ever be. My supervisor had only given me one instruction after our brief phone call several days earlier. Do not interfere unless public safety requires it. Let documented actions speak for themselves. That advice fit my own instincts perfectly. I went to work as usual, attended meetings, completed reports, and answered routine emails while my personal phone remained almost completely silent. Bethany probably interpreted that silence as surrender. In reality, it was exactly what experienced investigators hoped for when someone was convinced they had already won. Late Tuesday afternoon, I received an automated notification that another violation had been added to my homeowner account. This one included administrative fees that had never appeared in previous notices. The amount itself did not concern me. What caught my attention was the digital approval signature attached to the document. It matched neither the property manager nor any elected board member. Someone else had authorized it. I captured the record before the system could be updated and added it to the growing timeline. That evening, Frank stopped by carrying a small toolbox he wanted to return after borrowing it the previous weekend. He hesitated for a moment before quietly telling me he had overheard two board members discussing an emergency enforcement action planned before the end of the month. According to them, Bethany wanted a highly visible example that would discourage future challenges to the association. Frank apologized for not knowing more, but he had already given me enough. Emergency actions tend to create hurried decisions, and hurried decisions usually leave clearer evidence than carefully planned ones. After he left, I walked slowly around the empty space where my Jeep had been parked for so long, studying the driveway from every angle. The overhead cameras captured wide coverage, but I adjusted one slightly to eliminate a blind spot near the sidewalk. I tested the audio range, synchronized the internal clocks on every recording device, and verified that cloud backups were functioning normally. None of those preparations were dramatic. They were simply thorough. Before heading inside, I looked across the street and noticed Bethany standing in her front yard pretending to inspect flower beds while occasionally glancing toward my house. When our eyes briefly met, she smiled with complete confidence, as though the outcome had already been decided. I smiled back just as politely because there was no reason to reveal what she could not yet see. Every letter she had mailed, every meeting she had controlled, every unnecessary escalation she had chosen had become another carefully preserved piece of a much larger record. She believed she was building a case against a stubborn homeowner. In reality, she was creating a remarkably detailed roadmap of her own decisions, and with every passing day that roadmap became more complete than even I had expected. Wednesday morning began with an unusual stillness that made every familiar sound seem sharper than normal. The wind barely moved the flags along the entrance boulevard, birds gathered on the power lines above the cul-de-sac, and the distant hum of lawn equipment echoed across the subdivision. At exactly 9:12, my phone vibrated once. A secure message appeared with only 3 words. Stand by. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and continued watering the flower beds beside my front porch as though nothing had happened. Across the street, Bethany stepped outside carrying another clipboard. She looked completely relaxed, greeting passing neighbors with the same confident smile she wore during every board meeting. 10 minutes later, the familiar tow truck rolled into the neighborhood and stopped directly in front of my house. The same driver climbed out, exchanged a few words with Bethany, then walked toward my driveway carrying paperwork. Even from where I stood, I could see he never asked for identification, never knocked on my door, and never attempted to verify ownership. Bethany simply pointed toward the empty space where the Jeep had originally been parked before it had been relocated to a secured operational site after the first incident. She appeared confused for only a second before noticing another vehicle parked farther inside the garage with the door partially open. It was the same Jeep, returned overnight under official supervision exactly as planned. She smiled again, convinced she had found another opportunity. The driver hesitated briefly when he noticed the reinforced security hardware, but Bethany spoke with enough confidence that he continued. I remained exactly where I was, saying nothing. Every camera on the property captured the conversation from multiple angles, while synchronized audio recorded each word. The driver asked if authorization had been confirmed. Bethany confidently replied that the homeowners association had complete authority and that all required approvals had already been handled. Those words would become far more important than either of them realized. The driver reached for the vehicle, then suddenly stopped as several dark sport utility vehicles entered the subdivision one after another with no emergency lights and no unnecessary attention. They parked quietly along the curb. Men and women wearing plain clothes stepped out, displaying credentials only after approaching the driveway. Their movements were calm, professional, and remarkably organized. One supervisor greeted me by name before turning toward the tow operator and Bethany. He politely requested that everyone remain where they were while official documentation was reviewed. Bethany immediately began explaining that she was the elected president of the homeowners association and that neighborhood regulations gave her authority to remove non-compliant property. The supervisor listened without interrupting. When she finished, he removed a folder from his vehicle and opened it carefully. Inside were registration records, authorization documents, equipment inventories, and chain of custody paperwork identifying the Jeep as an assigned operational vehicle, supporting an active regional law enforcement task force. The color drained from Bethany's face as she stared at the pages one after another. She looked back toward the Jeep, then at me, as though seeing both for the very first time. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody celebrated. The neighborhood had become so quiet that I could hear sprinklers starting 2 streets away. The supervisor calmly explained that because the vehicle had been intentionally interfered with during an active operational period, every related action, communication, authorization, and supporting record would now require formal review. Bethany opened her mouth several times before quietly lowering the clipboard in her hands. For the first time since I had moved into Willow Creek Estates, she looked less like someone giving orders and more like someone realizing she had been reading from the wrong rulebook all along. The next 48 hours transformed Willow Creek Estates in ways no annual board meeting ever had. The same sidewalks where neighbors usually discussed landscaping and football scores suddenly filled with quiet conversations about document requests, official interviews, and unfamiliar vehicles parked along the curb. Nobody panicked because nobody had to. Every person representing the investigation behaved with calm professionalism, asking clear questions, collecting records, and thanking residents for their cooperation before moving on to the next house. What surprised me most was how quickly people who had stayed silent for years finally decided they were ready to speak. Frank was one of the first. He voluntarily shared copies of old violation notices, emails, and photographs that he had saved long after everyone else would have thrown them away. Another neighbor produced meeting minutes showing motions that had never actually been voted on despite being listed as approved. A retired accountant from 2 streets over quietly handed investigators spreadsheets comparing homeowner assessments with annual financial reports, pointing out discrepancies that had never made sense to him. Piece by piece, a much larger picture began taking shape. None of it centered on my driveway anymore. My driveway had simply become the point where years of unanswered questions finally converged. Bethany attempted to reassure residents by sending a neighborhood email claiming that everything was a misunderstanding and that the association had always acted within its authority. Unfortunately for her, digital records rarely forget their history. Archived messages, revision logs, approval timestamps, and official correspondence all remained exactly where they had been created. Every new record was compared against previous statements, and each comparison revealed another inconsistency. The towing company also found itself answering difficult questions. Investigators requested dispatch logs, service authorizations, billing records, and communication histories related to homeowner association requests. Once those documents were placed beside board records and neighborhood emails, the timeline became remarkably clear. What had once appeared to be isolated enforcement actions now looked increasingly coordinated. Throughout the process, I remained exactly where I belonged, answering questions when asked and otherwise staying out of the way. My role was never to direct the investigation. My responsibility was to preserve evidence, maintain professionalism, and allow established procedures to work exactly as designed. Emily called every evening after finishing work at the school, amazed by how quickly the atmosphere in the neighborhood had changed. For the first time since I moved there, homeowners were standing together in small groups instead of quietly hurrying inside whenever board members walked past. They were comparing letters, sharing experiences, and realizing that many of them had received nearly identical warnings over the years. That realization changed everything because isolated complaints can be dismissed, but consistent patterns supported by documentation demand attention. One Friday afternoon, I walked to the community mailbox under a bright Texas sky, noticing that the bulletin board outside the clubhouse looked strangely empty. The usual pages of violation reminders, warning notices, and policy updates had been removed. In their place hung a simple announcement informing residents that several association procedures had been temporarily suspended pending legal review. I stood there for a moment, listening to children laughing at the neighborhood park only a few hundred feet away. It struck me that the community sounded different. Not louder, just lighter. The fear that had quietly shaped everyday conversations for years was beginning to disappear, replaced by something far stronger than intimidation. People were discovering that rules only deserve respect when the people enforcing them respect the rules themselves. And once that balance returned, the entire neighborhood finally began feeling like home again. Over the following month, the investigation reached a stage where speculation no longer mattered because every conclusion rested on documented evidence instead of neighborhood rumors. Formal review meetings replaced emotional arguments. Financial records were reconciled line by line. An independent legal counsel examined years of association decisions against the governing documents that every homeowner had agreed to when purchasing property. The results surprised even longtime residents. Several enforcement actions had exceeded the authority granted under the community bylaws. Multiple administrative procedures had bypassed required board approvals, and numerous homeowner complaints had never been properly recorded despite official claims that they had been resolved. Those findings did not erase years of frustration, but they finally gave the community something it had not enjoyed in a very long time: a clear path forward based on facts rather than personalities. Bethany resigned before the special membership meeting could begin. Her letter was brief, thanked residents for the opportunity to serve, and insisted that every decision had been made in good faith. She left the clubhouse through a side entrance before most homeowners even arrived. I watched from the back of the meeting room as newly appointed interim board members outlined a series of reforms designed to restore transparency. Independent financial audits would become annual requirements. All enforcement actions would require documented board approval. Meeting minutes would be published promptly instead of weeks later, and residents would receive direct access to supporting records whenever association rules allowed. One proposal after another passed with overwhelming support, because people were no longer voting out of fear. They were voting with confidence that the process itself finally deserved their trust. The towing company also announced significant policy changes after completing its own internal review. Future requests involving residential property would require stricter ownership verification and additional documentation before any vehicle could be removed. Listening to that announcement, I realized something important. The real victory had never been about proving one person wrong. It was about improving procedures so the same mistakes would become far less likely in the future. Emily attended the meeting beside me, smiling quietly as neighbors who had barely spoken for years exchanged handshakes and introduced themselves as though they were meeting for the first time. Frank joked that it had taken one old Jeep to accomplish what dozens of board elections never could. Everyone laughed, including me, because there was enough distance from the conflict to appreciate the irony. As residents walked outside beneath the warm evening sky, children raced bicycles around the circular driveway in front of the clubhouse, while parents chatted nearby, without lowering their voices whenever a board member passed. The atmosphere felt remarkably ordinary, yet somehow more valuable than before. Ordinary is something people often fail to appreciate until it disappears. A few days later, I received official confirmation that every review connected to my vehicle had been completed. The operational equipment remained secure, the chain of custody had been fully documented, and no compromise to ongoing assignments had been identified. I closed the folder, placed it beside the collection of homeowners association notices that had started everything, and realized those papers no longer represented irritation. They represented a complete timeline showing how small acts of overconfidence can eventually collide with careful preparation, accurate records, and patient professionalism. Justice had not arrived through dramatic speeches or public humiliation. It had arrived one verified document at a time, proving once again that lasting accountability is built on evidence, consistency, and the quiet determination to let the truth speak louder than any position of authority ever could. 6 months later, the driveway looked almost exactly the way it had before that Tuesday morning, but I noticed details that I would have ignored in the past. The new security chain rested neatly beside the garage, stronger than the one that had been cut, yet I rarely looked at it anymore, because it had already served its purpose. Fresh flowers lined the walkway where Emily had insisted they should go. Frank had finally replaced the faded fence between our properties after putting it off for years, and children rode their bicycles through Willow Creek Estates without parents constantly glancing toward the clubhouse to see who might be watching. The neighborhood had not become perfect, but it had become something far healthier. It had become a place where rules were understood instead of feared. The Jeep still occupied the same section of my driveway every evening after work. Its faded paint had not changed, the scratches were still there, and most people would probably pass by without giving it a second thought. That was perfectly fine with me. A few neighbors now knew that it supported official work, but nobody asked unnecessary questions because they respected the simple boundary between curiosity and privacy. Every once in a while, someone new moving into the subdivision would glance at it and ask Frank why that old vehicle never seemed to attract complaints anymore. Frank always smiled before answering. He would simply tell them that some stories were worth learning before making assumptions. He never needed to say anything else. The message always seemed to land exactly where it needed to. One Saturday afternoon, the interim board invited residents to a community picnic at the park beside the clubhouse. There were food trucks, local musicians, and games for the children. Looking around, I realized I recognized almost every face, not because they had suddenly become close friends, but because people finally felt comfortable introducing themselves without worrying about who might be keeping score. Emily laughed with several teachers who had recently moved into the neighborhood. Frank spent nearly an hour helping a young family assemble a new backyard grill. Board members answered questions openly instead of hiding behind formal language or vague promises. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild, but every honest conversation adds another brick to the foundation. Before heading home, I walked past the clubhouse bulletin board. The display was filled with volunteer opportunities, neighborhood cleanup events, and reminders about the annual charity drive. Gone were the endless warning notices that had once covered every available inch of space. I stood there for a moment, remembering the sound of that chain striking the concrete months earlier. At the time, it had seemed like the beginning of a personal conflict. Looking back, I understood it had actually marked the beginning of a much larger correction. One careless decision had exposed years of unchecked overreach, and one ordinary driveway had become the place where accountability finally caught up with misplaced confidence. As the sun settled over the Texas horizon, I parked the Jeep in its familiar spot, switched off the engine, and listened to the quiet that followed. It was the kind of peaceful silence that cannot be forced, purchased, or demanded. It has to be earned. I locked the new chain, not because I expected anyone to test it again, but because some routines are worth keeping. Then I turned toward the front door with the same lesson my father had repeated throughout my childhood echoing clearly in my mind. Authority may convince people to obey for a while, but integrity is what earns lasting respect. In the end, nobody remembered who spoke the loudest at board meetings. They remembered who respected the law when it mattered most, because justice is never measured by volume. It is measured by patience, truth, and the quiet certainty that sooner or later, every choice leaves a record.